Hello and welcome to VHTV, your guide to the talent, culture, and capital forces shaping the hard tech startup ecosystem. My name is Brian Mejeur from AdAstra Talent Advisors. We partner with early stage hard tech startups, mostly in space, clean energy, defense, and also embodied AI, and help these companies fill their hardest to fill roles on the executive and highly technical side of things. I'm also joined by Matt Gjertsen from Better Everyday Studios. How you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. Hello.
And also Justus Kilian of Space Capital.
Hey Brian, good to see you.
You as well. So our last conversation was a fun one, and we were discussing if being a narcissist was almost like a prerequisite into being a strong, successful founder. And we spent quite a bit of time discussing what visionaries look like and how that relates to some of these narcissistic traits. We didn't spend as much time discussing some of like the quieter executors of our time. And so what comes to mind for me is Gwynne Shotwell at SpaceX, right? President, COO. And I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on how is she able to be such a driving force of the company and what makes her successful and how she pairs with Elon.
So I'll start out here. I think Gwen is probably one of the most underappreciated business leaders in all of sort of the startup ecosystem today. I think she has an incredibly complex job of working closely with one of the most brilliant, visionary, hands-on founders that there has ever been, but also has a ton of different obligations and priorities and is moving across organizations and, can get distracted. And the ability to be able to create sort of an umbrella for the organization to function in a consistent, repeatable, clear way while allowing the strong visionary technical leader Elon to drop in and solve big important problems, to me I think is probably one of the single most important things that she's able to do. And she can balance that while preserving the culture, the values, the priorities of the company, while also keeping him happy and keeping the company rowing in the right direction. And so that's sort of my quick summary. I'd be curious, Matt, what you think, having spent time there.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think I've always felt to look at some of the other companies that Elon leads, like Tesla is the main example. I feel like when you look at Tesla, it's obviously gone through a history of more chaos and less chaos. And it feels like the more chaos times are usually times where it's clear there's not another senior leader in the company that Elon really trusts or that has been there for a while or that he works well with or whatever it is. And I have no idea, like we're talking about personal relationships and none of us know how those actual personal relationships are going. But from the outside, it seems like the more of visionary, forward-leaning, hands-on, disruptive top leader you have, the more important that strong second is. Before we started this call, we were kind of talking about the book Traction, which goes into this idea of the entrepreneurial operating system. And that book talks about exactly this point of at the top of a company, you kind of need two different personality traits. You need the visionary of the person who's really pushing things forward. And then you have the integrator who can take all those ideas and kind of build them into the company. And I know in past shows, we've talked about this idea of you need different styles of talent depending on the stage of the company. There's a certain kind of personality trait that likes to build a company from scratch. And then once you have a product, it's a different kind of person usually who wants to kind of like figure out mass production and how to optimize processes and all that, this kind of stuff. And I think there's a similar nature here in that no company can exist in pure chaos, kind of whatever form of whatever stage that company is, but they're always pushing forward. And so there's always going to be this brief transition between like the chaos of doing something new versus how do we systematize it and actually execute with this chaos. And so I think that's where this becomes really, really important, is having someone who can take that and really distill it down. And it's probably for any founder, for any top leader, for every visionary, style of integrator you need is probably going to be different depending on their personality quirks, but it's an absolutely essential role.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying here, Matt, and like tying into these terms visionary integrator and with EOS. And There's actually a book, Rocket Fuel, that dives in specifically to the visionary integrator relationship and dynamic and
Nice.
like role and responsibility fits. Definitely recommend checking that out. And I think what's really important to know is, and what shows up for me is that a lot of these classic visionaries that we discussed in the last call or the last podcast was they bring something very specific to the table. And the thing that the integrator brings to the table, or in this case, Gwen, a president COO type, is very different. It's very hard to have both of these types of traits in one person. They're often like kind of in, I don't know if they're necessarily in conflict, but it's hard to be fully in visionary mode while also providing the stability when like the vision is a little more chaotic and all the things that you're talking about. And so I think that's a really good comparison to pull into.
There's a bunch of good data out there, and there's been a number of surveys that look at sort of the survivability of companies that are founded with like solo founders versus co founders. And consistently across these reports, what you see is a co founder dynamic is the most optimal. There's a number of ways to look at it. Like, do you raise more money? Are you able to, what's the longevity of the company? Do you have better revenue growth? One of the ones I just recently looked at was a 2024 survey that said co founders typically outperform founders at revenue growth by 160%. There's
Wow.
just that ability to translate the idea into a paying customer at a higher rate relative to the solo founder. And so, when we're approaching this question from investors, I have real skepticism when I'm looking at a solo founder, even to the point where when we're investing super, super early and it's just literally an idea in the back of a napkin, I've pushed hard at that first check in to make sure that there are one or two other key employees that have pretty large equity packages. So it's not just the solo founder, that there's a couple others that are deeply incentivized that are more on the execution side that are going to be alongside them and have big skin in the game. And so while they may not be a co-founder in title, at least there's, a strong incentive there to help sort of round that out.
I really like that. I feel like we see a lot of these difficult dynamics of being a solo founder. Like there's so many hats that need to be worn at the early stage, like in specifically in executive leadership. And it's lonely at the top. And so to have a solo founder be responsible for all these things that are sometimes in conflict, it can be really, really challenging. I do think it's extremely valuable to have some really strong executors on the team, whether it is a co-founder or like you mentioned, Justice, is just the early employees that are really strong, complementary skill sets with high equity stakes that can drive some of this forward and provide some of that stability so that the solo founder, if there is one, can lean more into some of those visionary responsibilities.
I'd actually be really interested, Brian, when you're working with companies, and I know you're mainly focusing on like hiring that early stage, like deep technical talent. Have you ever been in discussions where it's like since you're familiar with EOS, where you're kind of just like, oh, like you need an integrator, like you need somebody who can take this chaos and make it a little bit more programmatic. Like, have you ever been in that position?
For sure. I think that there's sometimes solo founders, they really do want to be able to do it all. And maybe they've missed the phase of being able to truly hire a co-founder. Maybe they don't need a COO that day, but like so quickly, I see the value in at least having like even a chief of staff or an executive assistant, someone who can kind of bring some of the realities of execution down to earth and take over some of those things so the visionary and this founder or the founder CEO can stay more zoomed out most of the time and focus on the bigger things. And I think sometimes these more solo founder types can be like really wanting to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. And I think it can catch up to them because at some scale, it like really doesn't work. And if you don't have a right hand, now you're trying to find it, but there's that much more complexity. You've built less trust. Like I really like trying to get that in as soon as you can, assuming it makes sense for the functions of the business, of course.
I think it's a really interesting point that you bring up of I can't imagine, especially in early startups, that this other role can be in an unexpected place. That like really the key of this role is the deep trust they have with someone who maybe isn't always that trustworthy of other people. If you think of the most visionary people, and this is going back to our conversation before, like they're used to being in those uncomfortable positions. They're used to people telling them that, oh, that's never going to work, and then proving them wrong. And so that kind of personality, it's going to be difficult to have a relationship with them where they will actually listen to what you say. Again, we're not in this relationship, but I have to believe that is the most important thing about what makes Gwen so successful there, is that for some reason, like she is able to talk to Elon in a way that others are not. Again, I don't know, but like it seems like that trust is just such a key component of these kinds of relationships.
And even if it's at the earlier stage, like Gwen did come in just like a little bit later, started more in business development. Like by the time
Yeah.
she was truly his right hand, the company was a little bit bigger, doing a little bit more. Now, if we're talking at like the really, really early stages, his executive assistant, Mary Beth Brown, I believe,
Yep.
was like this person early on. Like Elon was a solo founder. Like he had a really strong founding team with him, but he ultimately was a solo founder at SpaceX, but had a lot of this like operational grounded execution support and a high trust person in Mary Beth. And so I think it's a cool comparison to talk to.
Well, I would argue one of the most important things that Gwynne did early on was the ability to SpaceX didn't have a rocket. They needed to win some contracts and prove that there was an opportunity. And she was able to come in when all there was a team and be able to articulate why that was enough and what the team was doing and essentially sell the team when there was an absence of a rocket, right? And it sort of translated a lot of the technical work that was like being done into an actual business. And I think that was maybe one of the first proof points of her being able to sort of translate the complexity and the excitement of what was going on into a really tangible business outcome. And ultimately, I think how that, relationship, again, we're not in the room, but like, I think, to the point of trust, what you need is a competent, capable number two that can tell you, this is not a good idea, right? When you're such a visionary, when you're pushing the boundaries of everything, you need somebody deeply rooted in the business and the sort of technical aspects of it that can stand up to, an Elon Musk and be like, this isn't a good idea for these reasons and we shouldn't do it. Very few people can do that, right? And so I think in the absence of that, you get distracted, you sort of chase a lot of different opportunities and you can get really distracted. And I think that continuity, her ability to sort of filter through a lot of that has kept SpaceX on an incredibly impressive, consistent, sort of path as the company's grown. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I
that's
have to believe there's instances too where, we're talking a lot about how what if the solo founder is kind of the visionary, how do you find an integrator? But I'm sure there's instances of the reverse where like the person is more of an integrator. And in some ways, as everything that you were just saying, Justice, of being able to, I can imagine a world where it's like the more Gwen style person would have an easier time raising money and like getting it started because they can do that integration. They can do that, but maybe they don't have like the same kind of vision that leads to the ultimate success. And so I think there's the potential that the role that needs to be filled could be reversed.
I have
yeah.
actually been working recently with some founders that are just raising some capital, two co-founders, and both very technical. But the COO is actually the one that's leading the fundraising, that's more communicating the vision, that's more sort of big personality, has sort of that communication wherewithal, and the CEO is more product centric and deeply understands the
Mm.
technical aspect. And so, I mean, in some ways, those are titles. Like what you're looking for is the counterbalance, right? And you need both of those, I think, to be really successful. So, yeah, I don't think it's a fixed recipe, but this sort of idea of counterbalance is really important.
Yeah, and like in the book Rocket Fuel, it speaks to the idea that like the visionary, whether it's the CEO or the COO or the CTO, like whoever is ultimately wearing that hat, whoever it is, like their job is to create a lot of really big ideas, and a lot of those ideas will be really bad, and that's okay. They need to be able to partner with the integrator to pick the best ones, and then the integrator also needs to be skilled and capable of committing to executing those, even if they maybe disagree with which ones were picked. So I think that's like a key piece of what each of them is responsible for, and like how there's some yin and yang between them, which is a really beautiful thing. Fantastic. Well, this is a fun chat. We kicked it off with exploring kind of Gwen's role at SpaceX, how she's able to be so undervalued and also provide so much value to the company and balance out Elon and while still like driving so many things forward and conserving culture. And we've seen that SpaceX has been able to maybe be a little more stable maybe than some of Elon's companies where he maybe didn't have a number two that was quite as strong as Gwen at certain times. We also compared this idea to EOS, Traction, Rocket Fuel, these different brands that talk about the visionary and integrator relationship and how there's a different balance that can enroll between these two and how like that can lead to sometimes having co-founders that each wear one of these hats, sometimes in different roles, and what it looks like if you do have a solo founder and how you can augment these different roles in a solo founder situation. So
I would boil it down to every hard tech founder needs a Gwynne Shotwell.
yes,
I love
I
it.
love it. I love it. And that could be in a co-founder, could be in a strong engineer, could be an executive assistant. I think it
Exactly.
could come in a lot of different ways. Fantastic. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.